Welcome to Unity Now, the podcast where we discuss unity in the face of division. Inspired by the Unity 2020 plan, we strive to unite Americans by highlighting the middle ground between the two dominant parties and promoting the individual over groups. Each episode, we will bring you exciting, well-informed guests and host nuanced conversations about politically charged subjects. Our goal is to bring an end to the ideological war threatening the collective well-being of this great country.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Unity Now and our mission to highlight individuals and groups that are working toward common ground. I have the honor of being joined today by a PhD, an author, and a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts, Chris Forman. Hey, Chris.
Hi, how's it going? Thanks for inviting me along.
Yeah, thanks for agreeing to come on the podcast today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah, beautiful sunny day here in Pennsylvania. Yeah, it's really good. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
So to get kicked off here, you're a published physicist many times over, co-author of the book, The Brave Green World and How Science Can Save Our Planet, and you're an advocate of Deliberative Democracy, and you're the director of the Deliberation Gateway, a thematic network of the Royal Society for the Arts.
Yep.
So what led to your advocacy of Deliberative Democracy, being such a published physicist?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, definitely, for me, science is, that is what I am primarily as a scientist. And I was looking around at the world and thinking about how science was being used and abused in politics. And I was kind of like, particularly specifically with things like climate change. I was looking at why aren't people moving on this? And I'm trying to understand it. And looking at the technology around, I know that we can fix things like climate change, and I'm like, well, why aren't we? And it was clearly something to do with the way that decisions were being made as a group, like particular influences were having sort of inhibitory effects on mass decision making. And so I started to I heard of this organization called 38 Degrees. I don't know if you've heard of it. This was way back.
I don't think it doesn't sound familiar.
No, this is a UK organisation, and the idea is that 38 degrees is the angle that snow makes, and if you get above 38 degrees, you get an avalanche. And so there's all these pressure groups, activist groups, who are all fighting to try and get their message heard, just like the corporate lobbyists trying behind the scenes to get, so everyone's fighting to get their message heard and get their insight and input into politics so the decisions reflect what they want. And this organisation, 38 Degrees, realised that there were all these individual groups. They've all got the same infrastructure. So what if there was one organization that could kind of channel all the voices and build those relationships with the government and make campaigning more effective? And they asked me, I got involved by signing a few petitions, and then they asked me to be the local area coordinator for Cambridge in the UK. And they asked me specifically about this thing, a bee pesticide campaign that they wanted to run, where the EU had banned bee pesticides of a certain type, neonicotinoid. And there was a provision whereby one of the member states of the EU could overturn that ban locally if there was sufficient cause. And my county, Cambridgeshire, in the UK, the government had given permission for Cambridgeshire to overturn the ban. And of course, all the activists were like, you can't, the bees, we've got to protect the bees. And then the lady at 38 Degrees phoned me up and she said, so, will you head up a campaign? And I said, well, what evidence is there that the neonics harm the bees? And she was taken aback. Well, you're meant to be on my side. You're not meant to ask questions like that. And so I was like, yeah, but I'm a scientist. I can't just go around saying, anything willy-nilly. So, and in the end, I realized that the activists were as deaf as the politicians, right? And I'm like, oh my goodness. Yeah, everyone's banging their drums so loud and no one's getting hurt and everyone's fighting against each other. And so what we ended up doing was having these huge meetings. There would be something like, you can imagine in a place like Cambridge in the UK that the people there are very easy to get up in arms about pretty much anything, right? So, and it's a fun place. And it's my spiritual home, really. Anyway, So it was easy to get like 100 people in a room to talk about anything. And we did. We'd regularly have these huge meetings with 100, 150 people, and we'd split into groups to talk about our pet topics. And that was the point. We were agnostic to the topics, and we were working in groups, and we were trying to get good quality information. And I tried to set up a round table. I tried to get like beekeepers and farmers and the corporations who were making the pesticides and local government. And I tried to get everyone around the table so we could just figure out what Cambridgeshire should do and hear everyone's point of view. And I did not know it, but I was instinctively creating a deliberative democracy approach to solving this. And we didn't need permission from Liz Truss or anyone. I say Liz Truss because at the time I think she was the appropriate minister. She had to make the decision, and I was reading through all of these parliamentary proceedings. Like who made this decision to overturn? And there was a room full of scientists, professional scientists, who picked them? I don't know. They were just there in this committee. And then Liz Truss was there, and they talked, and they were talking, should we make this decision to overturn this ban or not? Who made that decision? It was a small group of people. No one knew who they were. And then at one point in the minutes of this meeting, it says, an industry representative walked into the room, gave a presentation, and then left. Okay. No mention of who that was or what information was included. It just said industry was allowed behind these closed doors, and they gave a talk, and then all the decision was made in favor of these big corporations who were, and with Liz Truss on, who would be surprised if Liz Truss. So, and I'm like, okay, something's got to change here, and we've got to go and make a difference. I'd unwittingly reinvented deliberative democracy. Yeah. So that was how I got into it from a science point of view. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. And so I think I know enough about what's supposed to be, a scientific process with like what the idea of a double-blind study is, to say that you have two groups running in parallel where not one knows about the other, and one's given medicine, one's given placebo, essentially. Not even the patients or the doctors know.
Right.
Is deliberative democracy essentially a double-blind study, but it's not two, it's hundreds together, to where they're brought in at random. There's random selection. You don't know anything about each individual other than maybe the last 10 minutes in that event. You didn't know anything about them besides maybe like 10 minutes conversation and just literally physical interaction.
Right.
And so it's a massive scientific study, done, in real time. Is it?
Wow.
Is that maybe a way to relate it scientifically?
Oh, you could think about it like that. I mean, I suppose the way to think about it is more about sampling and how you choose a representative sample.
Right.
So if you've got a population, and we can talk about this in purely scientific terms, we can take the human equation out of it in some respects. We can say, okay, here's just a group of people. They've got N beliefs. I don't care what those beliefs are. I just have a group of people, and we want to make a policy which is going to fit for the whole population. What's the best way of doing that? And it's very scientific to say, well, let's take a random sample of people, pop them in a room, and we'll see what that small group of people comes up with as a policy. You could do that N times, as you just said, N times, and then see, and then by the central limit theorem, they'll sort of all average out, towards the same kind of policy. That's the idea. But then there's some interesting questions there. That raises interesting parallels of how do we choose representatives now with elections? But are the resulting cohort of decision makers, are they in any way representative of the sample as a whole? Should they be representative? Should they be? Intuition says, well, yeah, because if we're going to make a policy, we've got to understand how every part of the population is affected by that policy, and so that you don't get a minority interest overbearing over everyone else. And of course, the problem with elections is that you can buy them. I read an article the other day where it was talking about all these different politicians in Congress, an independent, Republican, Democrat, it didn't matter. And all this article talked about was how much money they had in their war chest. Right? So I'm like, okay, so this is not a fair sampling, right? This is heavily biased towards people with money or already got power. And so as a result, the decisions that get made vis-a-vis climate change and everything else only is of interest. The only decisions that get made are benefit those people who pull the purse strings. And so, so I'm thinking, a random lottery is a very scientifically intuitive way to select. The preferred term is a civic lottery, where we get people from everyday walks of life to come in and talk in a mini public about what they think the decision should be. And then what's really beautiful about that from actually from a science point of view, like if you take a poll, this is sorry, I just had a thought and I'll show it within 2 seconds.
Yeah.
And if you take a poll, you measure prejudice, right? You measure like a snap judgment of what that population of people thinks right now.
Right.
Whereas if you have a deliberative component to a decision-making process, if I select a group of people randomly, pop them in a room, and ask them to talk to each other, then they're all going to sort of interfere with each other and measure each other's sort of, they're all going to change their positions. And that's what a deliberation does for you. It allows you to change your position. So from a scientific point of view, it would be a bit odd if I took my scientific sample and I allowed them to intermingle so that they could change each other. Kind of want independence.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So in that sense, it's a bit different. What gives you, and in this case, the question is what gives you the best outcome in terms of policy? And that's a really difficult question to judge because it's best outcome for who, right? And so exactly right. Anyway,
yeah. How do you measure what best means for what group, right? Yeah, it is best. What gives us the best policy, but what gives us the policy that is best for the most individuals is maybe a better way to look at it, but not the best way to look at it.
You could say
that. Because and I would argue, like you said, that elections can be bought. And I would say the bigger you go, like local town council elections probably can be bought, but probably most aren't bought. But the higher you go into national elections, the more they have to be bought, I say, to be won, essentially, like presidential election in the U.S., of course.
Totally.
But what happened in that situation where you created that deliberative democracy situation?
Oh, with the bees
in Cambridge.
What was the outcome?
Yeah, what was the result? Yeah.
Okay, well, this is a good question. So the first thing is that I completely failed to achieve this goal, right? Nobody wanted to come to the meeting. Nobody wanted to sit down. The only person I managed to persuade to sit down and talk was the local politician who thought he could score some points, and they did a little radio segment and stuff on it. And there was a news person there. And then I got into trouble because I sort of had a journalist asked me lots of pushy questions, and then he was like, so do the pesticides harm the bees? And I'm like, well, you can't say. I don't know. I'm not an expert. And somewhere in that interview, he decided that I said that pesticides cause the bees to harm. And so he published this article saying, Cambridge scientist says pesticides harm bees. I'm like, it's not even my field. It's not my field. I tried to get the scientist whose field it was to come and talk. She wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. I'm not going anywhere near a bunch of activists, and that's quite a reasonable position, And so, she does. And then I got my fingers stung a little bit, and then this local newspaper guy, it all came out, and then I got my wrist slapped by Cambridge because I was, using the Cambridge name and muddying the waters and so on. And so it was. That's what happened. So my lesson from that is that there's a right way and a wrong way to go about these things. Okay, and that's where I started to take a much more sort of learning-based approach, where I would sort of network with people who were already like practitioners and theoreticians in this area and domain, and really start to understand more slowly how you do this. And there's definitely a right way and a wrong way to go about setting up a deliberation, particularly if you want that deliberation of randomly selected people to actually have an output that makes a difference, and so that's the lesson that I got from that. Trying to do it by myself without really knowing what I was doing was possibly not the right way of doing it, but if I hadn't done that, then I wouldn't have learned that this whole thing existed, and I wouldn't have got switched onto it as a concept. So,
yeah, I kind of liken the process to what is, well, at least supposed to be the American jury selection process, right? That random selection that ends in a deliberation during that case, essentially, that must be where those concepts must have come from maybe the same place, the same kind of an idea, maybe. I mean, they definitely use the same kind of language, and always have. I've received a letter in the mail for jury selection, which to me seems totally random. They totally random selection for me as a juror. Of course, the lawyers get to try to divide out who's going to be on that jury, but the selection itself is random. I believe that in the first place, and so that's kind of the idea, right? Is total random selection of individuals who come together, and then they would have enough information in front of them to make any kind of group decision that's representative. Judgment
is the right word. Judgment. That's what you're asking. In a deliberation, you're asking a group of citizens to make a judgment, and to make a deeply considered judgment, because not everyone has got the time to go off and read 20 books or 30 papers on whatever the topic is. So what the idea is, if you can create a space where people who have, you clear their decks for them, you bring them in a room, and you say, you pay all their companies so that they're not going to lose their jobs, and you have to clear all the barriers so that, if one of them's a parent, that their children are looked after. If someone's disabled, they get an ambulance to come pick them up. Whatever they need, whatever individual needs are, but to get this group of people together, you work really hard to bring this group together so that you actually have this randomly chosen group, which has all the right properties. And then they spend a lot of time deliberating and making a judgment. And a lot of that time is spent learning about the issues, which is then to compare that with a court. That's true. And a lot of the time the jurors are just pulled in there. Oh, never really thought about this before, and then someone will be there to tell them what the finer points of the legal thing, nuances are, and you have to make a judgment and then talk to each other, and the idea there is that your humanity, if you want, your sophisticated neural net can process and bring in a lot more sort of side information about morals, about other things, than just say, a clinical analysis of a legal document, And so that's the point. But where it differs from juries, in the jury, you're making a judgment about a person, and there's probably going to be no consequences for you as a juror what your decision is, right? And
Good point,
so there may be some sort of long-term consequences if it was a big trial and there was an important case or precedent that was going to be set by it. But for the most part, you're just judging consequences for that individual who's in the dock, kind of thing. Whereas in the deliberative democracy system, you're making a decision on behalf of the whole of society, and that's incredibly humbling, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the people who get picked for these kinds of, there's all these little videos on the internet, vox pops of people coming out of these kinds of deliberations, and they're always saying things like, there was love in that room. Everybody really liked each other and we got on. We all felt so humbled that we were there. We were all like, we really wanted to do our best decision that we could. And that's such a contrast from what you hear politicians talking about, where they never say anything committally. They're always evading and beating about the bush, and then the newspapers try to discredit them, and all the rest of it. So there's some very big differences between the jury and the say citizens cohort, for want of a better phrase. But perhaps one similarity is that nobody really wants to be there, right? Not at the beginning, anyway. Nobody really wants to get selected for jury service. Probably no one really wants to get selected to go on one of these 4 weekends or 5 weekends or maybe even a year, depending on the situation. Like, this is going to put a hole in my life, I don't really want to do it. And in some sense, that's good. You want people who don't want to be there. You don't want these career politicians who are trying to be there the whole time, and they've got skin in the game, and they're thinking more about their career, or at least partially about their careers and their parties and who's funding them for the next 10 campaigns, and they're allowing that to influence their judgment on a decision in Congress. It just makes it more complicated, a more complicated decision, whereas this deliberative process with this group of citizens can sort of say, well, this might affect me in a good way, and I like this, I don't like that, I hear, and they see the other people in the room as human beings. That's the most important thing. They don't see them as red or blue or someone on the other side of the fence. They see them as, well, we're all in this together. And I don't really care, if you're a man or a woman or you're rich or you're poor or whatever characteristics you've got. Let's just forget about all that. And let's just really get down to brass tacks and think about how this is going to affect us in this room. And we're hopefully a pretty good representation of the whole of the population. So however it affects us is going to similarly affect quite a large percentage of the population. And if we've done a good sample, then we've got a nice group, and then we haven't left anyone out in the cold. And what's really beautiful about this is that a minority can influence the decision. Like, their point can be made and heard in the room, and allowance is made for that, but without overriding them completely. Like in our sort of first past the post system, it's winner takes all, and that's it. And if you're shafted by this law, tough luck. We are our, what's the word? When you have our ideology and our sort of biases are going to win and compete out over yours, and that may not be a good basis for making a decision at all. Like, why should my feelings or theory of divinity about who created the universe, why should that be allowed to come to bear on whether or not we have taxation on oil pipelines, right? Whatever. Right. I'm just like, is it okay if it's relevant? Use that as inspiration, but there shouldn't be like a group of people who all agree, e.g., that say oil is automatically evil and therefore we are going to ban oil, because that's just going to hurt so many people, right? On the other hand, if you burn all that oil, it's going to produce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that's going to heat the whole planet up, and then we're all going to be in trouble. So we've got to balance that, figure out how to do it in a step-by-step way. And that's where the idea of this deliberation is that you can really allow people to see other people as humans, look at all of the different points of view, and make a rational, wise decision about that topic, but without any of these external influences trying to pull it or distort it. And so that's the rosy side of the equation. Okay, that's what the supporters think that will happen.
Right. Yeah, and it seems like they're at the top of it. Should be no downside. It's an actual representative decision-making process that is, like you said, not about electing politicians who want to be there, who want the power, who want to be seen as the person that's, on the website and, gets to be interviewed and all the times. And like, that's what I said back in the Unity 2020 days. It's like, maybe when we elect the president, we ask everybody, like, who wants the job? And everybody raised their hands, and then everybody who raised their hand, we say, all right, you're out.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
That's the first question. Like, do you want the job? And if you do, you're not within the decision making.
That's it.
But then there's certainly many ways this could be gamed, maybe. Yeah. And then how does this also apply? Like the American election process has been copied and pasted all the way down to public school boards. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure those elections can be gamed, but because at the end of the day, they are people that want to be there. Mm-hmm. And these are parents within the school system who have full-time jobs, so they don't probably have a lot of time to do this. Maybe they do, but they want to be there. And so, you could always question why they want to be there versus that school saying, all right, we're going to just select random parents to be on the school board from that area of town.
Right.
And now you're going to serve in a deliberative democracy school board, idea. And it's like, so how can this be gamed? But also, how do you get to start changing this, with all these examples?
Yeah. Okay.
Getting the people who want the power to decide to give it away.
Right. That is a really good question. Okay. So, yeah, let's think about that in a couple of ways. So it can be gamed, I think, a little bit, but you've got to be very careful about how you set up your deliberative process, what questions they're asking first. So it's actually quite hard to organize the citizens' assembly, like a big one, something like the school board example where you used, it's easier just to get a random selection, more like jury, and they're just on it for a year. So it depends, firstly, on the situation that you're talking about, like how you might game it. Like if you wanted to take 30 citizens from across the world and get them to make a recommendation, you'd have to buy them all. It'd be really hard. So in some ways, I think the way to sort of game it is through mass marketing, because you don't know who's going to be picked. So you've got to make sure that you've got a good chance of your person getting in on that board, right? So you've got to have a sizable chunk of the population who believes as you do. But then with something like social media, that's possible, right? And that's kind of what's happening right now, where you end up with lots of, people who don't really listen to anybody else, being sort of in their bubble, reinforcing each other's like initial beliefs. And actually, as a result of that, what's happening at the school board level, I read an article the other day talking about this, that the national stereotypes are starting to filter down to the local level. So people are picking local people based on the national sort of propaganda, if you want, on either side of the equation.
Right.
And so you end up, there was an example where like a school board just got fined $1.5 million or something. I think it was in California somewhere, where there was 3 essentially conservative activists who got elected, banned a certain type of influence on the school books or something like that, and then the California people said, no, you can't do that, it's against the local law, and they got fined. So but that's an example of where activists are trying to get in on the school board. So I think that's what's happening locally. That there is this sort of national sort of stereotypes coming forward on, and that's how people are choosing elections. So to address your second question, how do you locally get people who have power to give up power in order to transfer it over to a lottery selected group?
Right.
Well, yeah, most of them don't want to do that. And most of them, when you say, we're going to sort of move away from elections, they'll be like, no, go away, run away. But occasionally, yeah, that was very Monty Python, wasn't it? Run away. Sorry. But occasionally, though, you can have a problem which pops up, which is important, and everybody knows it's important. And nobody wants to stand on the ticket because everyone kind of knows what the solution is, but nobody really wants to be the person who has to stand up in an electoral battle and say, let's do this, everyone, it's going to be great. And then, so you can peel away topics. You can peel away topics that are toxic in a council chamber or a local council chamber or a school board. You can peel it away so that the elected person doesn't get tainted with this bad decision. It's kind of like when you employ a consultant to fire everybody. It's like that kind of thing. It's like you can actually say, well, let's get this citizens' assembly to make this decision, and then we can say, well, that's what the citizens wanted. So it could be a way to make unpopular decisions. But as soon as people start to realize, have some examples of that and start to see and have experience, and as soon as you know someone who's been on one of these panels, you can hear about it firsthand, then you begin to learn more about it. Actually, it's a really cool process that people actually enjoyed being on it. And quite often what happens after these processes have taken place is that campaigns form. Like the people who were on it were so energized by the process that they start to take an interest in local politics, and they form campaign groups coming off the back of these deliberations. So you suddenly start getting citizens who are really engaged. And when citizens are engaged and you've had this non-partisan process coming through with deep, good quality information, making this considered judgment, and this campaign group knows that their decision is a good one, right, out of all of the options, because they weighed them all up.
Yeah.
So they can campaign for it. And then that means that local politicians who ignore that, well, that's going to look bad. Everyone knows if it's communicated properly, like if the local media communicate it well, instead of getting people in trouble, they actually communicate it well. And they sort of say, okay, here is then everybody in the community knows what the output of that deliberative process was. And so why aren't the local politicians supporting that? It was non-partisan, but you're on a red ticket and you're on a blue ticket and you're supporting X, you're supporting Y, but that's the national thing. What matters for here, like in my town here, whatever, in some local town where the people, matter, and they, and I think that might be a way in which you start to elect people who would actually consider the output of one of these citizens' assemblies. And then you've sort of got this, then you get this alignment suddenly between what the elected people are talking about and doing and the citizens who are this random sampling. So it's a way of building a bridge between the decision-making processes and the local communities, allowing them to sort of have this deliberative process. There's no reason why the elected person can't take part in that sort of deliberative town hall or whatever it is that you're talking about, and then sit down and really hear and understand people's points of view. That's going to help them win elections. It's going to help them get a much better pulse on what's happening in their community. And what's really beautiful about these deliberative processes, especially when there's a lottery attached to it, it's not the same old people. Like, we all know who the people are in our community, who are the people who jump up every time, the dam is going to get built or the dam is going to get destroyed. Whatever it is, there's always the same people who leap up with their placards and go, that's the 38 Degrees Brigade. They're well, we're doing the same thing. We don't care what the campaign is. We just want to campaign, So it's like, all right. Whereas if you have a lottery, then you get the people who are sort of not the sort who turn up at town hall meetings shouting and screaming. They're just kind of like, well, yeah, let's just make a sensible decision here, folks. And what's the best plan? Let's get some information and make an informed judgment. And then maybe if you did that, I'd probably vote for you, mate. So I think that is how. We're going to slowly allow elected people and to sort of, follow the judgment of a citizens' assembly, but also it's a way of people building trust in citizens' assemblies. And it's not just deferring power immediately to a random group of people until we've really tried and tested this, like really figured out how it works in different situations. So I think that's the important key there. And
I like that. As an example, it's like the original idea of the free market economy. It's like the free market of ideas, where after it's done, if politicians don't listen to what that example was, then nobody's going to vote for you now.
Right. Yeah, especially if we just spent 6 months figuring this thing out, and now you're just completely ignoring us. It's like we know. Yeah. And then you start getting independent standing, saying, "Hey, I'm going to stand on a deliberative democracy ticket. I'm going to do whatever the township deliberative democracy says, and I will vote for that in Parliament or wherever, and in my council and my school assembly, whatever." And that way, you suddenly get people, who are trusted. Going into this position, who are really listening to the people, and you just get a much better sort of flow of ideas into legislation, and much better resistance to individual lobbyists coming in, because this is a powerful thing. Essentially, it's a way to get a large group of people to get a single voice, that's powerful, that can then compete with an oil conglomerate who's coming in, taking all the right people for dinner and writing legislation. I mean, quite often with the revolving door, what happens is, lobbyists, whatever, will actually write a piece of legislation on behalf of XYZ consortium. And it's only people who want to get up to no good who want to change the laws, right? Yeah. So all these people that are representing, private interests, third-party interests, and writing these legislative proposals that get put in and passed. So what we have here is a mechanism for a group of citizens to also write proposals, to write legislation, draft legislation that can then be inserted into and voted on by, a formal parliamentary process. So it's a way to balance that process, and that is exactly what the Paris Citizens Assembly is set up like. So I mean, far from being theoretical, this is actually being implemented now around the world, and I think that's really important for people to realise that different democracies around the world are actually doing this. It's not just, as some crazy scientist from Cambridge who thinks it might be a good idea. This is really mainstream now. It's becoming more and more mainstream. Yeah. Plenty of examples to talk about.
Yeah, and that's a great segue. That's definitely one of the questions I had is to give examples of where this has unfolded. I think, like in Iceland and in some places of the UK and Australia, there's plenty of examples now that I've started to look for this. And before that, really, I've never heard of these examples, unfortunately. So that's maybe another thing to think about. But tell us about some of the best examples that we're seeing across the world.
All right, I'll give you a couple of examples. So, I mean, the big one, I'll start with the big one first that everybody talks about, is the Citizens' Assembly in Ireland. And what happened there was similar to what I described before, where there were deadlocked situations. Nobody in Ireland wanted to talk about certain key issues. This is my sort of understanding of it, filtered through a few videos and so on and so forth. Right? But I know people who were there, and this is kind of, reporting secondhand what they've told me. And so there was these politicians who wanted to make these decisions, but they were kind of locked, and they couldn't make progress on these decisions. And so they set up a series of about 8 different deliberative processes, where they picked a group of 100 people, 60 citizens and about 30 politicians formed this deliberative cohort, and they hosted it in a hotel in Ireland somewhere, and then they would meet up every weekend and talk about these different questions, and one of them, for example, was about abortion, and there was a big conversation about whether or not we should change the constitution on abortion, and so they had this deliberative cohort that met. They wrangled with it, and they were exposed to input and testimony from many people, from people who had first-hand experience of of all the different outcomes you can have with abortion, and hearing how that affected people's lives. And I think for example, there was a testimony from one mother, I believe, who had been raped and became pregnant, and then just what was her position on this? How did that feel for her when every day she had to look at her child, and that was a daily reminder of that trauma that she'd been through? Those kinds of personal, first-hand, visceral experiences that people could share. And so this was a really in-depth conversation where humanity was allowed to come to the fore. And after that process is finished, this group, they made their recommendations on what should happen with abortion. And then after that there was a referendum, and there were basically a large campaign was set up to say, take the output of the deliberative process, compare it with some other choices, and then allow the whole population as a whole to vote. Now, and what happened, of course, with the Citizens' Assembly, you've got this report where there's deeply considered information looking at all sides of it, not just pro-choice or pro-life. It's just looking at everything, all the humanity of it all. And these are the recommendations on balance that we think would be the best policy. So anyone on either side can read this kind of report, knowing that it's coming from a balanced place, and then see whether they agree or disagree with these kinds of recommendations. And I believe, I can't remember the exact statistics off the top of my head, but I think it was something like these recommendations had a supermajority in this group, something like 70% support for this. And then when they had this referendum, lo and behold, the population also had about 70% support for the proposals. And so in this case it worked, that the broader population was well represented in that deliberation, and they came to a similar conclusion that most of the population would have come to, and you got a supermajority. Because they had that supermajority in a referendum, they were then able to actually change the constitution in order to implement this new law. Whatever that group decided was the wisest thing. And then they had a whole series of other deliberations on climate change and some other topics as well. And that's an example at the biggest scale. Okay? But there's plenty of examples, and a really good place if you want examples is to look at a thing called participedia.net. That's a URL, participedia.net, and that allows you to. There's about something like 3,000 or 4,000 case studies of different participatory processes. But in the US, a bit closer to home, there was a citizens' assembly over in California in a place called Petaluma. I hope I pronounced that right. And what happened there? There was this fairground that was up for development, and it had been sitting around for a while, and people didn't know what to do with it, and the lease was coming up, and what was going to happen. There was lots of opinions are running strongly on all sides. So they did a lottery, and they got a group of people together for real, got them to look at this and make this decision. And this is run by an organization called Healthy Democracy, who are actually coming out of Oregon, and I'll talk a bit more about them in a moment. And they ran this deliberative process, and they kind of allowed this group of people to do a deep dive on this fairground. What should we use for it? And it became this sort of piece of co-creation, all the different people were starting to think imaginatively about different ways forward with this fairground, and they made their list of recommendations, and which is awesome. As far as I know, I don't know exactly what the outcome of that is. It's actually still ongoing, I believe. But these citizens have been allowed to say what they wanted to do with it, this fairground, which had this historical role, but it wasn't being used. Do we like developers come in and just build hotels on it, or do we actually keep it, and what do we use it for? Balance these different insights out, which is cool. So, two extremes, two examples where decisions can get made using these kinds of processes, and there's dozens more. What I found out about recently, even the French military, they have a randomly selected group of people from all ranks. It's like a committee within the French military who actually use a sort of lottery deliberation process to make some decisions. There was a peculiar set of circumstances of how this came about, but it's fascinating to know that you can use it in many, many different contexts. It's not just limited to formal legislative processes, but it can be used in many, many ways. It's just like voting. That's
shocking to hear that it's used in a military example where the line of leadership is supposed to be the end all be all.
Right.
I'm maybe even more surprised to hear it happen in California of all states.
Wow. Yeah.
And more of our right leaning audience would agree that's surprising to hear. But that's where things are way oversimplified, of course. Yeah. California's blue and nothing can change there. Right. Like where I live, Indiana, it's always red and nothing can change here. Right. But the example in Ireland, I heard about the result of that and how it was a good result in that it was it was representative of the people there. I did not hear about the process and how that happened at all. And I don't go to mainstream media in the U.S. I have independent media sources that I use and listen to, like Breaking Points and things like that. And I just don't recall hearing that was the process. Right. I'm curious, throughout that process, do you get to hear about who the individuals were in that process at all? Or is it purely about, you do?
I believe so. It's not like sort of anonymized testimony. Okay, I'm not 100% sure about this, so, I have to be careful what I say. But I think that the Citizens' Assembly in general, depending on the context, they have the power to call people like you might get for a judge, or for a courtroom situation where you can subpoena people. Let's say I really need to hear from the CEO of Exxon. Does a Citizens' Assembly, like a select committee, or in the Congress, does it have the power to subpoena people and say you've got to
subpoena?
Right. And so, in principle, if you were working with a process which had full authority of law, and an elected person had delegated some power to a Citizens' Assembly, then they would then have that power that person had. Like the president said, we're going to have a Citizens' Assembly on gun safety, then fine. Presumably that would then have the authority of the president if he said so, right? And so that you could do that, and there's no reason why you couldn't do that. Or you could do it similarly for any difficult topic that's deadlocked in Congress that nobody wants to achieve, or that people can't get past. I feel like there's something about that's kind of going back to my scientist hat when I think about designing a system to make a good decision. When we think about Congress the way it's set up at the moment and the concept of elections, and I'm looking at this more as a sort of engineer, just looking at this as a system. What's working with it? What would I fix if I had the power to just change a little bit here or there? And to change the Constitution, you need a supermajority.
Right.
But to win an election, you need to get 50% of the votes. And so, the Democrat Party and the Republican Party, they're not one party. They're many factions that have clubbed together to win 50% of the votes. That's why there's as much tension within those parties as there is between the parties, right? Because they're not one group. They're not one. They're just some sort of twisted, malformed sort of representation of all these different factions that kind of comes out on top. And then one of them just pips the other one, and then suddenly that's policy, And so, but it can never reach the supermajority in Congress because to win the first past the post, you you only need 50% of the vote. And now everyone hates each other with this horrible polarization that you can never get to supermajority and you can't make these decisions. So the whole system, in some sense, is designed to not make decisions. And that's great if you're like a full-on Republican where you want to keep your rights, and that's the way it should be. That's, here's our rights. You shouldn't be able to change rights easily at all. These are our rights. We believe in them. This is what we have, and they shouldn't be changed. But on the other hand, if something's not working about those rights, if there's some unintended consequences of those rights, you still need to be able to tweak it, adjust it, in a sensible way. But it shouldn't be easy, but it should be possible. But with the system as at the moment, it's not possible. Right? It's just not.
Yeah, shouldn't be easy, but should be possible. Yeah.
Right. And so I feel like citizens' assemblies as a bolt-on to everything that's happening in the system at the moment could be a really powerful way to get some movement, get some momentum away from polarization, away from polarized decision making into serious topics, decisions, judgments. And what's beautiful about these kinds of citizens' assemblies, they don't have a term limit as such, right? Like when I'm a politician, I'm elected, I only have 4 years or however long I've got on my term to make a decision. And then so the decisions only last up until the next election, and then everything flips around again, and then we try and do something. Some examples of that in the UK, like the NHS is used as a political football, between all the political parties over and over again. We're going to have this policy, and now we're going to have that policy. And the poor doctors who are just trying to heal people are just, can you just leave us alone? Just set one policy and then leave it for 50 years, please. And then we can at least get on with our jobs, and if it's not working, we'll tell you, and then we can, find some way to solve it. But,
that's that's the U.S. presidential election. Biden gets elected.
Yeah.
Executive orders to undo what Trump did, and if Trump gets elected, he's going to undo everything Biden did. Yeah.
Exactly. And so a citizens' assembly, on the other hand, can say, okay, well, this is our policy, and this, there's no term limit on this. This is what we think is a good idea. And, you can have a review in 5 years if you want, and they'll probably come up with the same conclusion unless something's changed. And that's what you want. If the conditions on the ground have changed, you then need to be able to have that reflect in the decision-making process. But if the decisions haven't changed, if their conditions haven't changed, then the decision will stay the same, And so it can give you ability for long-term decision-making. And when you're looking at competitors on the international stage for the US, like people like China or Russia, they are more than capable of making long-term decisions. They can have long-term policies with 50-year horizons just because they don't have to worry about elections and all the rest. I mean, nominally they might worry about elections, but we all know that that's not really the case. And in fact, the Chinese system is actually quite deliberative. And it's quite cool. I was talking to a colleague of mine at Cambridge who was, from China, and he was telling me that he described how it was organized. That they had people from each street would go and form a little committee, and then the people from the town, and so on, all the way up to the top. And they had 7 layers of different abstractions of hierarchy, and people would go from one committee to the next. So actually, it is kind of deliberative. It's not as, maybe you all have to be part of the party, and the only way you can get on one of those committees is if you understand the party rules. But, it's not perfect. No system is perfect, but it goes all the way up to a giant congress. I think there's about 2,000 people at the top in the Chinese parliament who advise the party executive. They advise them, and so there is this kind of deliberative process. So they can have 50-year horizons.
Yeah.
They can say, we are going to switch to solar power and phase out coal, but we're not going to do it straight away. We're going to do it over 50 years, and that's what they've got. They've got a 60-year net zero policy. But by 2060.
Is that? Yeah. Is that enough to stay off any kind of revolt? Maybe just enough involvement.
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, I'm not. My understanding of that Chinese system is I've read up on it a little bit, but not a huge amount, and I'm not an expert on it by any means at all. But I'm just saying that deliberative processes could help give us a long-term horizons, long-term decisions that would stand over time.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
So what are the steps that you're taking, with the Deliberation Gateway? What exactly are you trying to do to get this involved into the U.S. system of politics and decision making, is it going to take some sort of candidate at a high level to begin talking about this, to involve it in any kind of decision making process? Like, I'd love to hear what you think about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And because I keep hearing about him and seeing his interviews, like, he might actually talk about that. I'm not sure if he even knows about it, or if he would, be a person that would talk about it. But I think he'd be the closest type of person we might have that could bring it up at a high level. But what is your company trying to do across the nation with these solutions?
But firstly, Deliberation Gateway isn't a company as such. It's just a network. It's a thematic network of an organization called the Royal Society for the Arts, which is actually a British organization. It's been around for like 250 years. They're kind of social entrepreneurs, people who meet in coffee houses and think, what if we could do this? What if we could do that? And many people have heard of the World Fair in Chicago and other places in the US. And this was based on the Great Exhibition in London. But the Great Exhibition way back, that was the brainchild of the RSA, right? So so it's that kind of thing. Like, how can we create these kinds of processes behind the scenes to make things happen? And so I've been running this network for 5-6 years now, and in that role, my task is simply just to connect people, just to find people and connect them. And the fact that you haven't heard about it says that I need to work harder, right? Which my wife won't like. But so what's our strategy now is it's actually quite straightforward. You may have heard of Braver Angels. Have you heard of Braver Angels? They're an amazing organization. I'm actually an ambassador for Braver Angels, and they're forming.
And I'm sure most of our audience has heard of them. Yeah,
brilliant. And I went to the conference in Gettysburg as a sort of partner of the Braver Angels movement. They're setting up the partnership. They're trying to create this process of civic renewal across the whole of the United States, where people can re-engage with politics in a non-partisan, healthy way, where they tackle this polarization and talk to each other. And I'm really excited to be part of that network. And my role is to talk about deliberative democracy within that network. Like, how can we get it? Something that struck me at the conference, when I was hearing about all these amazing stories from all across the US, like tackling with homeless people in California in a fair way, and there's lots of examples like organizations like Bridge USA who are working on campuses to get left and right talking on campuses, and there's all these kind of common ground workshops that Braver Angels has implemented and done. Essentially an event making machine, right? And they're just really good at getting local people into a room and talking across the divide. But they stop at a certain point. I've noticed they've got a lot of the elements of deliberative democracy. They have that deliberative component. They have the non-partisan value right up front, which is perfect. That's just what you need, that neutrality in your selection process. But they stop shy of like saying, okay, this is what we think policy should be. And I think that's correct. I think that's correct for Brave Rangers to not adopt one policy or another, because they're just trying to get a process going. And in fact, Healthy Democracy, who are professionals in deliberation, that's exactly what they do when they try to set up a process. They separate process and content. So we've got to think, what is the process that we're using here? And what are the decisions that are being made, the actual meat of the sandwich, so to speak? And so separating out those the process and the content is really important. And that's what we can do with the engineer's hat. And we can say, okay, so what we need then, what's missing is this little gap. We've got these deliberative processes. We've got people across the US through Braver Angels experiencing this kind of deliberation, particularly things like the Common Ground Workshop. But how do we translate that? What's that next step? What's that gap between there and local legislation? We've already described some of that. So I'm working at the national level with the event designing committee of Braver Angels to design a new process, which is more about forming an action plan, forming a campaign group. I said before that when you have these deliberations, people come out of it energized and they want to form campaign. So it's about forming campaign groups locally around that are non-partisan, who can then locally talk and influence local elections, right? And we're designing a process to do that. And at the same time, so that's at the national level. the same time, we're sort of working as a hub in the network. The more hubs there are in the network, then the more, the easier it is for these concepts to propagate. So making sure that all these organizations are connected and know about each other, and that there's many, many ways for them to talk to each other. It's not just one single point of failure, And then, so what we then built, that's at the top level, designing this new event and then communicating about it around the network. But then also we're going to try pilots out in specific cases. So locally, we're going to try and engage local politicians with the Braver Angels Alliance, where we're going to test out this new event and see if we can engage local county supervisors, local county elected officials to get engaged with one of these processes, to try it out. Just, in that way, it's just, hey, we're just trying it. It's an experiment. It creates a space where people can have an experiment where normally the normal people aren't there. Well, if you're using a lottery, the normal people wouldn't be there. If there's no lottery here, it'll probably be the usual suspects who turn up. But it'll be deliberative, and it will be a whole new approach to engaging a local community with their sort of elected officials. And so we hope that that's going to be successful, and we're going to keep trying that until we find a recipe that works. And once we've got a recipe that works, you can then implement it across the whole of the US through the Braver Angels network. They can pick up the template and then go. And so suddenly what you've got is a pipeline from people in the bar who are fighting because one's red and one's a blue, arguing about this, that, and the other, or family at Thanksgiving, all the usual scenarios. Suddenly you've got a process for taking those people, getting them to sort of confront their inner polarization and saying, hey, come on, this person's got a point, that person's got a point, let's talk. All the way through the common ground workshops, right the way through to a campaign where it then starts to influence local politics. And when it starts to influence local politics, then it will begin to, we hope it will begin to sort of filter upwards, when people begin to experience this for themselves, when they've met people who've been in this process, and they suddenly realize, and you suddenly start this slow reformatting of the whole country's, concepts and make it so that we are considering long-term decisions. We aren't just considering who's going to get elected next and so on and so forth. So there's a sort of plan that's emerging, and that's just one. And there's many other examples of people who are trying different approaches all across the US who are trying different things. An organization called Democracy Without Elections, which I was the education coordinator for. They are promoting this idea of lotteries in different places. And they're trying to build up a sort of mass movement. And another example is Assemble America, which is brand new, and they're trying to get sort of media attention, and I think there's a bit of money behind that one as well to get some campaign. And I believe that's coming off the back of people who were involved in the Andrew Yang's campaign, right? So there's some sort of serious people starting to look at that. And in terms of getting senior politicians to look at deliberation seriously, I think that would be fantastic. If we could get, I don't know if Joe Biden's listening to this, if he's got a problem, hey, how about giving a citizens' assembly a go? Maybe Rob Kennedy could sort of come and have a chat, and then we can sort of say, hey, yeah, let's try it. Let's get up as far as we can go. That's the case.
Right.
That would be wonderful. But I don't know much about Rob, but there are politicians who see the value in this, and there are political systems around the world who see the value in this, and they're beginning to make this transition so that we can get laws that really reflect what people actually want and need in their lives.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you would know when you start to see it affect local elections, then you know that something's happening. So how would you know when it is affecting local elections? What would you see then? What I
hope you would see, and whether this will translate into actually what happens, who knows. What I hope we would see is campaigners who are trying to get elected agreeing about the points that come out of these things. They're suddenly, instead of attacking each other, they're sort of going, we have to adopt that, and then sort of saying, well, obviously, I think it would be like, but Johnny wouldn't adopt that, and then Johnny would say, but actually, no, I will. And they'll be arguing about who's then the most in tune and connected with the people, which is
right.
That is what I would like to see,
Yeah.
And instead, they'll find ways of twisting it, I'm sure. But Yeah, I would like to see an end to all ad hominem attacking and more sort of focusing on issues. And these kind of assemblies, there are ways in which those issues can be raised locally. Yeah. So that's what I would like to see more of.
Yeah, that's a great example. Will they even recognize the results of such an assembly in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
And then will they say that they would agree and go forward with that decision-making process? And would they then blame the other person to say, well, you're definitely not going to listen to that process? And like you said, they'll begin to argue and fight over who's going to be the person that listens to that result the most.
Right.
Instead of, just telling about what's happened in each other's lives and what idiots they both are.
And I think a really important thing for anyone who's a sort of elected person who's starting to get cold feet and panicking about, oh my God, about this, to get the most important point is that when you set up one of these processes, whoever's elected they should commit to listening to the output. They only have to commit to listening to the output. They don't necessarily have to agree with the output or not, because if they have the formally selected power, they have a job to do, and they may have other considerations that the other public aren't privy to, which may or may not be a good thing. But it means that they at least should consider it and demonstrate that they've listened to it. And I think that's what we'll be hearing more of. I've heard that citizens' assembly, they make this point. However, I am making this point, and I'm making this decision because X, Y, Z. And then people can say, fair enough, got to respect that person for taking that position, But on the other hand, 70% of us all agree with the citizens' assembly, so we ain't going to vote for you, So, but I think it's about. I was trying to reassure elected people that it was a good thing, and I might have undermined that. But but what I'm thinking is that it's not black and white. There's a sort of grey area where sometimes it's useful and sometimes it's not. And for example, in the Parisian assembly, which is awesome, they've set up this in Paris. This is only sort of local to Paris. It's not national across France. This is local to Paris, where they have a permanently selected citizens' assembly. They picked about 100 people who sit for a year in this room, and they form a new parliament, and they're paid. They're paid a salary, which for many of them is a pay rise. They're suddenly paid like an elected person's salary to be there in this room and to make these sort of. And what that group of 100 do is they think about what the topics should be that are on the agenda. They have agenda-forming powers, which is something that at the moment is only the parties have agenda-forming powers, right? That or the government, but here the local citizens can have this agenda-forming power, and they once they've got a list of topics, they spit one or two of these topics out to another group of randomly selected people, not the original group, but a second cohort of about 20 people. I think it's 17 to 20 people, and then that second cohort does the deep dive on that one topic, and they're the ones who actually learn a lot about it, and they make a lot of recommendations. And then those recommendations come back to the first cohort, who then draft a legislative bill, with advice from people who are good at writing, lawyers and so on who can write bills, people who have that skill. They help them write this draft based on the recommendations, and then that draft bill goes to the elected council, who is then obliged to vote on it, yes or no. And so there's this formal process for creating legislation written by citizens to reflect the needs of the citizens that can then go and then be elected on by a parliamentarian or a council member, which is a powerful process. And we can all watch the Paris system and then decide, can we do something better, or is that really good, or should we adopt it? And it would be yeah. So,
are those 100 people and those 20 people are new people are picked like every so many months or years?
Yeah.
Or is it the same 100 people
okay.
for perpetuity?
Okay, I'm a bit hazy on this exact point. I believe that like a quarter of them are replaced every 3 months or something like that. But I'm going to have to...
a quarter of them. Okay.
Yeah, it might be. I'm not sure of the exact numbers there, so I have to qualify that. I have to go and check that. But there are, I think it's done where you that way you retain some experience in the room as you replace a certain percentage of the cohort. And that's a sort of standard way of doing things. So you get fresh blood, fresh insight, but you sort of balance out the experience and the new people. But you could do it a complete every year, whole new set of people, but then you're going to spend 6 months training up the new cohort of you. So it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off.
That's true.
Imagine that's quite a terrifying experience for an elected person the first time they have to go into Congress to sit and and say, what do I do here? Where's the restroom? All that stuff that humans do, right? And so how what's that process of sort of being indoctrinated into making decisions in Parliament, understanding how all these backroom committees work, and there's a lot of entrenched power. And actually, that brings up an important point that I feel like I should make. That citizens' assemblies aren't like a one-pill panacea for everything, right? They're a tool that can be used, and and you select a group of people who are then a new elite, right? So this is what the critics of citizens' assemblies say. This is a new elite. They're just as aloof and separate from the rest of the people as an elected group. Why would they, that group, maybe one of them's got shares in some company and he's particularly charismatic and I can persuade the others to go this way, something like that. But so there needs to be a process besides the formal selection and deliberation. And I can put my scientist hat back on here and I can start to think about humans as forming relationships, networks of relationships. That's kind of what humans do, right? They form little cliques and groups and communities. And whenever you come across a problem that you're trying to solve, you have to sort of feel out who those communities are. Who are the groups? Who are the important people in those communities, And there has to be a parallel process of engagement alongside the citizens' assembly, which is part of the communication process of what's happening inside that chamber. And you need to get community leaders who are there, representative in all the cliques that are in society, to be aware of the citizens' assembly and to have an input into it. And you need to have, they're quite hard to organize, right? And they can be quite expensive. Like if you've got to do this random lottery of 50 people or something like that, and you've got to pay their time and transport and everything, they can end up costing quite a lot of money, to $100,000 to $400,000, depending on the situation. And so you end up you have to have a steering committee, a group of people who set the questions and agree what the question is that this citizens' assembly needs to answer. That's what's beautiful about the Parisian model. They've got this agenda setting and the deliberative process, like a bicameral arrangement. Whereas if you're going to do this for real in a local town, maybe it's too expensive to set up the permanent bicameral arrangement, And so you have to do this kind of ad hoc stakeholder sort of figure out what's going on, get the right people in the room to then design the citizens' assembly. And if it's going to have teeth, then you have to include all of the right appropriate cliques, in that network. And having that parallel process going along beside it is really important. And I think you can think about political parties in the same sort of mental picture, that they're actually these networks, these cliques that form across the whole of society, like the political party. Yeah. And the politicians are just like these spores. They're just the bright coloured leaves at the top, the ones that attract all of the bees, And you chop off one of those politicians, but that megalith remains behind, this huge monstrosity of a party where the power is, and you end up with these two things fighting. But it's absurd, like I said before, to think that, you could fit the whole of the complexity of a human life into either one of these groups or one of those groups. Always there's some things I like about the Reds, there's some things I like about the Blues. Why do I have to pick one or the other? And you can calculate, as a scientist, you can calculate what's the information content of a vote, and you can say, what is it in bits, and the answer is not very much, right? It's like, it depends on the field. If I'm picking 8 people, if I'm choosing between 8 people, then my tick is 3 bits of information, right? 2 to the power 3 is 8. And so my vote is literally 1 or 2 or 3 bits, and that's it. And you add that up across the whole of the US population, what is that? 300 million times 3 bits? Well, I doubt that's even 2 two MP3s worth of information, you know, two songs on your iPod, you know, or your iPhone. And that's the total mandate from the whole of the American people, the whole of the US citizen population. That's the total amount of information, your entire life, everything, how your nuances, your beliefs, your opinions, you know, your tax opinions, the size of your house, how many kids you've got, all compressed into that one really grainy image of the whole of the, you know, pixelated snapshot of the whole population. And then the politicians say, well, this pixel here is a slightly grey shade, so I'm going to say that gives me a mandate for all of my policies on nuclear, this, that, or the other, you know, whatever, you know, and suddenly the politicians, there's a huge disconnect. And I think the most important thing here is about getting information from people so that they feel that they're part of a community, so that they feel like they're being heard. And that information is definitely being acted on by the political process, and that the laws that are coming out are just much better quality, much wiser, and it's a more ongoing process where, you know, it's a much better decision-making process that can, you know, help resolve all of these deadlocks, you know, and that's why I got into this in the first place as a scientist, so that the information and decision-making could improve in quality, and that's, yeah, I think we've gone full circle. Yeah.
I like it. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you kind of summarizing that way.
Yeah.
You know, maybe to wrap up, just tell people, how people can get involved with the, Deliberation Gateway and how they can help.
Yeah, okay. Deliberation Gateway, go on the website, sign up to the mailing list. That's the easy one. Also, you can check out Braver Angels, get involved in Braver Angels. I would heartily recommend that. Support a local alliance as a whole process going through there. And you can also look at Democracy Without Elections and see if that tickles your fancy. That's more about lotteries. You could definitely go and sign up there, and they need volunteers to help sort of hand out flyers, talk about it, you know, organize meetings and talk about it. And if you sign up to the Deliberation Gateway mailing list, then we're going to have conversations, quarterly conversations over the next sort of year. We're just going to keep organizing very light conversations. It's just about connecting people and getting people up to speed and asking questions, and, you know, it's about connecting people who know about deliberative democracy with people who don't. And so that's how to get involved. Those three organizations are a damn good start, and a new one is coming online. It's a bit premature for me to talk about it, and that's Assemble America. But watch out for that as it begins to make progress. So those are the groups that I know about. And I hope there's more, and if there are more groups that resonate with
it's great that there are it's great there are so many in the first place,
right? Then they should definitely get in touch with the Deliberation Gateway and talk, come to the meetings and just announce themselves, and then we can start to engage Braver Angels on their civic renewal process and begin to this transition to a much better democracy.
Okay, we will make sure to put all those links like in the show descriptions and where we put this on social media. And, are you on social media at all yourself, Chris,
actually,
that you want people to go to?
I took a break from social media because it was starting to hurt me, so I'm not. But I used to have
not a bad idea.
I used to have a LinkedIn account, and I want to finish on one thought.
Get
it right. Change moves at the speed of relationships, and relationships move at the speed of trust. And I feel that social media kind of like erodes relationships. So I cut away from that, and I'm concentrating on building real relationships in the real world, and I find that to be a whole lot more satisfying. So let's all build relationships, rebuild relationships, and that's what democracy is all about.
Awesome. Yeah, the formula for change, right there. You heard it.
Yeah, Forman.
I like it. All right.
Okay.
Well, Chris, thanks for joining us and taking the time. Yeah, and we'll be looking for you going forward, and let us know if you need any help with anything, and our team will sure to be involved however we can.
Thanks very much, Toby. It was my pleasure.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you later.